In 2003, the US and UK saw some of the largest protests in history in opposition to the Iraq War. When interviewed about these protests, President George W. Bush's response was that, quote, "Democracy is a beautiful thing," and that, quote, "I welcome people's right to say what they believe." Then President Bush proceeded to ignore the demands of the protesters and go ahead with the war anyway. George W. Bush's decision to ignore the millions of people protesting the Iraq War, a war justified in the name of bringing democracy to Iraq, all while claiming to respect democratic rights to protests, speaks to the hollowness of US democracy and liberal democracy more broadly. In such regimes, you can criticize the government as much as you want, but you can't actually influence much of what they really do. But many people believe that this is a sacred democratic right, always on the verge of being taken away by a much worse threat of fascism. But what if these democratic rights to express dissent are no more than privileges that are allowed to exist as a means of social pacification and political legitimation, rather than being an opportunity given to the people to challenge that system? I personally will never forget the time when large-scale climate protests were happening in Canada where Greta Thunberg was attending, and in response to the protests in Ottawa, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau voiced his support for the protests and literally walked into the protests himself to high-five a bunch of protesters, while proceeding to do practically nothing to seriously combat the climate catastrophe or at the very least stop oil pipelines from being built on Indigenous territory. Remember the massive Black Lives Matter protests that occurred in 2020? Well, they elicited two different responses from Trump Republicans and Biden Democrats, which make for an interesting comparison. The Republican response basically involved Trump calling in the National Guard to violently crush the protests. Meanwhile, the Democrats' response was to performatively take a knee for George Floyd and support Black Lives Matter, while proceeding to do virtually nothing to ameliorate police brutality or advance any sort of systemic change. This second, more liberal response to protests is the more interesting one to study, and it is often the more effective one. Most people typically understand this phenomenon as co-option, whereby the establishment co-opts progressive elements to pacify voters. But I argue that there's a lot more going on here than just co-option. The tendency for so-called liberal democracies to tolerate large protests while doing nothing to implement the demands of these protests reflects a much larger, multifaceted phenomenon, one that I argue challenges us to rethink our traditional conceptions of power and political hegemony. In this video, I'm going to present you with a quite unconventional theory of power, resistance, and political hegemony. It is a theory of what can be called contained opposition and the desublimation of protest. As we will see, this theory is quite different from most conceptions of so-called controlled opposition.
Part of what makes this country special is that we respect people's rights to have a different opinion.
When it comes to the notion of controlled opposition, some of us may think of things such as the CIA Congress of Cultural Freedom funding a compatible left that would pose no serious threat to the power and agenda of the overarching establishment. The theory of contained opposition essentially goes as follows. As the philosopher Michel Foucault famously said, where there is power, there is resistance. Many people take this idea as a case for hope. However, I tend to be quite skeptical of this assumption. I would like to flip this Foucauldian notion on its head. Where power is strong, there is resistance without power. A truly powerful order is not one that removes all resistance, but rather one that tolerates or even encourages resistance. That is, resistance without power. In most critical works of social science and philosophy that diagnose our current society, the writer usually concludes that there are always gaps in the system that forces of resistance can take advantage of. But not all gaps are cracks in the system's power, and not all acts of transgression, even when they are fugitive, are necessarily subversive. One should consider if many of the system's gaps are left open by design. Allowing spaces for dissent is not necessarily a weakness that makes a liberal regime a less powerful society of control than a totalitarian dictatorship. Quite the contrary. This liberal toleration is often a feature, not a bug, of a society of control with far greater confidence in obedience. which some consider to be the very definition of power.
Please rise for our national anthem.
The regime that truly holds the most power over its citizens, just like the parental authority who can most effectively shape the will of their children, is not the overbearingly authoritarian one, but rather the one that allows some space for resistance, while remaining confident that these transgressions do not stray too far beyond their will. Psychology tells us that the best way to get your children to follow your will is not by being an overly controlling helicopter parent, but by guiding their will, rather than suppressing it. By letting the kids go play outside when they want, while shaping the terrain on which they independently walk, so that their path does not stray too far from your ground, so that the will of the children will generally stay in line with the will of the parental authority, even after this authority ceases to be present in their lives. Let the youth be radical while they're young, so that they can burn out and become disillusioned. And as they get older, they will soon succumb to the established ideologies, which will help give them simple answers to cope with the chaos of reality. The most powerful socio-political orders incorporate a similar logic of power when it comes to both their subjects and their rulers, who temporarily occupy the steering wheels of the great machine. The regime with an intelligent approach to power often tolerates opposition that is compatible with its general logic, resistance that is containable, what we may call contained opposition, rather than controlled opposition. To contain means to hold something from within. The containment of social change does not entail the prohibition of all dissent, nor does it require the state to tightly control its citizens, but rather it refers to keeping dissent at the margins, away from real political power. An intelligent regime that is secure in its power would be foolish to fully eliminate all social protests, when all it needs to do is to contain opposition in such a way that it is prevented from manifesting into a force capable of actually challenging the established parties and their policies. To preserve an illusion of democratic freedom, it is often necessary for a system to occasionally allow oppositional forces perceived to be relatively radical into the spaces of political power, so long as they remain marginal, decaffeinated, and without much influence. A system can maintain its legitimacy by shining light at the end of the tunnel, to give people hope that they can change it. And those blinded by the mirage fail to see that this light at the end of the tunnel is another train about to hit them. But whether this is the case is not always clear, which is why, in the next section, we must illuminate the dialectic of power and the dilemma of hegemony that all regimes inevitably face. But first, I want to make something clear. Liberal democracy, even if it is quite far on the spectrum of being a managed democracy with inverted totalitarian characteristics, is obviously still preferable to an actual fascist dictatorship, where you don't have any freedom of expression at all. And despite the thumbnail, I do not want this video to give you the impression that all protests are useless. Clearly, if all protests simply didn't matter, then certain media outlets wouldn't be spending so much effort negatively portraying certain forms of protests while being supportive or indifferent to others. As we were saying, depending on the government in question, some types of protests are clearly perceived as more of a threat than others. And the government can choose to either violently shut down these protests to prevent them from spreading, or they can tolerate them, make some small compromises, and let them fizzle out. As we will see in the next section, although the second strategy is often the more intelligent form of soft power, there are still risks to both of these strategies. The dialectic of power and the dilemma of hegemony. The notion that absolute power corrupts absolutely is widely considered to be common sense. A government, political party, or ruler that attempts to exert too much control over its population and eliminate all opposition will inevitably fall under the weight of its own power, as the inevitable abuses of this power may cause the people to no longer recognize the legitimacy of this authority. To overcome this dilemma, a system must include an internal self-suspension of power, to regulate itself. A system of mediation that allows forces internal and external to it to keep its power in check, yet ensuring the stability of power through a system of checks and balances and the toleration of opposition creates an indeterminacy that could potentially open the door to the possibility, however slim, for radical adversarial forces to capitalize on moments of crisis and displace the reigning power. So the system has to facilitate an equilibrium of compromises, to buy off forces of resistance that may turn fugitive, However, these compromises might simultaneously exacerbate resistance by empowering the opposition and opening doors to new challenges to the system. This dialectic of power can determine the fate of a regime. However, there is a way that a regime can overcome this dilemma of power, through a system of built-in openings for transgression. Such a system may be slightly more immune to this dilemma of power, as it anticipates a cycle of power and resistance by taking advantage of it. A system that allows for an internalized game of power and resistance can serve a stabilizing function for it. Such a strong system can develop immunity against the diseases it produces, which manifests in the mass upheavals of the herd, by adapting to the sentiments of the multitude of combative forces once they are compromised, so long as they are deprived of power and political antidotes. This internalized cycle of power and resistance facilitates what I call the desublimation of protest. This theory is clearly inspired by Herbert Marcuse's concept of repressive desublimation. In psychoanalysis, what is called sublimation involves a process whereby a repressed or unsatisfied need is channeled into another action. On the other hand, desublimation involves temporarily satisfying that need, so that it doesn't need to be sublimated, at least in the short term. However, Marcuse himself mainly just used this theory to describe the phenomenon of consumerism and how it dulled people's consciousness by keeping them in a perpetual loop of desire and temporary gratification, which he believed had a pacifying effect that gave people a false sense of happy consciousness that prevented them from rebelling against the status quo. But what Marcuse did not fully consider was that this very logic could be applied to the act of rebelling itself. For a moment, Herbert Marcuse comes close to acknowledging the phenomenon that I call the desublimation of protests, briefly in his book titled Counter-Revolution and Revolt, but he never fleshed it out. For instance, Marcuse critiqued the hippie movement during the counterculture for having a, quote, tranquilizing rather than radicalizing effect, and he critiqued what he saw as the problem of pacification and depoliticization in anarchist communes, but he never fleshed this idea out. The theorist that I'm aware of who comes the closest to conceptualizing the phenomenon that I call contained opposition is none other than Slavoj Žižek, and his psychoanalytic concept of inherent transgression. The basic idea of this concept is that every effective legal order and its dominant ideology has a certain space of inherent transgression built inside of it, that gives subjects a sense of freedom and distance from it. This includes spaces where people can transgress the establishment, such as rock concerts, bars, strip clubs, unruly sporting events, edgy radical online spaces, and protests, which are often juxtaposed with activity on the internet as if it's inherently superior, when in reality it can also be its own form of placation. For the most part, none of these spaces actually stand as real threats to the established order, aside from a few exceptions. These things actually reinforce the existing order by making us more invested in it. My theory is somewhat similar, except it's more so a political theory of hegemony, and the ways in which the relationship between power and resistance in liberal societies reproduce class domination through the simulation of an illusion of democratic politics that serves to legitimize the legal order of the political system that supervises modern capitalism. This theory of contained opposition treats rebellion and protests in liberal capitalist democracies as rules of the system that reinforce its authority, rather than as exceptions that allow it to be democratically challenged. Tolerating a certain level of protest and civil disobedience so that the desire for agitation can be temporarily relieved in ways that do not threaten the status quo should be regarded as an understudied law of hegemony. Effective governmentality, just like effective parenting, acknowledges the inherent human urge for transgression and disobedience, and it allows people outlets to relieve this urge before it gets out of control. This can desublimate the energies of ordinary citizens seeking meaningful change, whose time and energy are already limited by the demands of life in capitalist society. Allowing for a multitude of spontaneous disorganized protests accelerates the time it takes for sequences of political action to reach their point of saturation, by allowing protesters and activists to more rapidly reach a state of exhaustion and burnout after discharging their energies in fleeting, short-lived revolts. Most importantly, the tolerance of such protests preserves the democratic legitimacy of the system, the appearance of political contestation, and the guise of freedom, all while containing most of the risks associated with liberal democracy, like instability, fragility, the power of citizens, etc. However, this theory of contained opposition is also dialectical, These liberal freedoms to protest that reinforce the status quo can also potentially be flipped on their head by people who choose to use them to go beyond the system's logic and seriously challenge its power. When this happens, the democratic system typically reveals its true autocratic colors, and resorts to more classic forms of hard power. But the deployment of police in response to protests to restore civil order may obfuscate the reality as to whether the protests in question actually posed a real threat in the first place, or if the police were just called in to quash it mainly to appease the reactionary sentiments of the conservative voters. America, the highest form of hegemony? Despite granting its population some of the most powerful legal advantages for resistance, such as the widespread access to firearms, freedom of speech, innocence till proven guilty, the US regime has successfully maintained a level of class domination unparalleled anywhere else in the so-called free world. This speaks volumes to the extraordinary level of power that the American corporate state holds over its citizens. The regimes which wield the most power do not rest on eliminating all resistance, nor do they rely on brute violence to maintain hegemony. Classically totalitarian regimes are not truly powerful, they are internally weak, as they are not confident that their populace will still obey the system and return to business as usual if spaces for dissent and criticism are opened up. Contrary to popular common sense, power and freedom are not diametrically opposed to each other. Power at its highest manifests when freedom and obedience coincide, when the freedom of the dominated does not threaten the hegemony of the dominant. Whether the actors filling the roles of the system's power relations change does not necessarily change the power relations themselves. The long-term viability of a system can't depend on the power and cult of personality of a charismatic leader who rules with an iron fist. That is because if this leader falls through death or castration, the curtain of legitimacy that veils the system's authority will fall down with it. For socio-political order to maintain long-term hegemony, it must firmly establish a legal system and institutional framework that reproduces the system and its class structures for generations, regardless of who is taking turns ruling it. This is the real genius of America's founding fathers and the framers of the US Constitution. They successfully created a system that protects not just their personal interests, but the interests of wealthy property owners as a whole for generations. After all, the Founding Fathers, influenced by John Locke, envisioned a system that championed the right to revolt against a despotic government, while simultaneously preventing any such revolt from endangering the power of their social class. They built a system with virtually unchangeable structures designed to meet the needs of the property-owning class and its factions, while effectively excluding the propertyless majority from all spaces of power. It's a self-regulating system that ensures its long-term stability through a decentralized separation of powers that prevents one single faction of the dominant classes from monopolizing power at the expense of the rest of the dominant classes, while also having centralized institutions of terroristic power that can destroy internal or external threats to that system, without any public accountability. But it must only go after enemies that it can get away with eliminating, or those who pose a serious threat to its hegemony. For the rest of the population, the main form of social control must be a form of soft power. Dissent can be tolerated so long as it's disorganized and amounts to nothing. When a population is too demobilized and too depoliticized to do anything, the regime should have no problem allowing harsh criticisms of it. It won't be affected by a few dissenting forces that expose the state's past crimes, years after they have already been committed. The American state has even allowed public access to some national security documents that straight up admit to some of its past lawless endeavors, like some of the CIA-backed coups around the world. Given such confidence and obedience, one must reconsider. Has the power of the American corporate regime truly declined? Contrary to the environment of the McCarthy-era Red Scare, in recent decades, media corporations have had very little issue platforming various films and TV shows echoing anti-capitalist critiques, albeit even if such critiques are often shallow. At first glance, the fact that surface-level anti-capitalist critiques are becoming more fashionable may suggest that the public is becoming increasingly more conscious of the system's flaws. However, vague diagnoses of the existing society's ills does not make a dent in the political scene, so long as there are not alternative political prescriptions on the horizon. If anything, pseudo-politics and enabling one-dimensional critiques of the system might even strengthen it. It is in the system's interest to allow people to vicariously enjoy their transgressive desires, through consuming politically conscious media to feel better about themselves. And this can also be the case with so-called real-life activism, like engaging in depoliticized activist initiatives promoted by the non-profit industrial complex. In fact, there is a whole activism industry propped up by NGOs and facilitated by neoliberal universities. There's a great video on this from the YouTube channel called Another Slice, which I highly recommend watching. Allow me to share a personal anecdote. Back in my undergrad days, I was enrolled in a certain university program geared towards pumping out individuals who would become part of what can be called the professional managerial class. Those who graduated from this university program would typically go into one of the three career pathways. They would either end up working for the government bureaucracy or one of the mainstream political parties, end up somewhere in the corporate private sector, or find an internship within the non-profit industrial complex. This one typically attracted the most left-leaning people in the program, whose progressive moral inclinations would be exploited by NGOs who would give them the illusion that they are changing the world. In other words, all three pathways would lead straight into the hands of the establishment, what we might call our socio-political matrix. I saw firsthand how people got reabsorbed into this matrix, but I managed to get away from it, and so can you. Concluding remarks. The theories being expressed in this video are by no means to suggest that all protest is futile or that radical change is impossible, even in the United States. Yet premature calls to just stay optimistic, if amounting to blinding delusions for coping with the chaos of the real, can be just as crippling as nihilism.